Përshëndetje shikues të nderuar, në kuadër të këndit të debatit do të realizojmë një intervistë me profesorin e marrëdhënieve ndërkombëtare, zotin Aidan Hehir, me të diskutojmë për zhvillimet e fundit politike në Kosovë, si dhe për zhvillimet në arenën ndërkombëtare. Professor, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
What brings you again here in Kosovo?
I'm here for a conference that's been organized by the Institute for Crimes Committed During the War in Kosovo. I was speaking at the conference on Monday, and it's on Tuesday and Wednesday, and the contributors at the conference are going to write chapters for a book that I'm editing about the work of the Institute.
Professor, I want to ask you about the recent elections in Kosovo. You have seen the results. Of course, we are waiting about the votes from diaspora, but we know that the self-determination is the first party. But for Prime Minister Kurti, these elections were a referendum. He said that I want 500,000 votes, but that did not happen. Why do you think that Kurti was not able to get majority once again?
Well, I think it's very hard for any government to win a majority consecutively. I think that was always going to be extremely difficult. You know, the results last time, I think, even exceeded what the party themselves imagined they would achieve. So that was an extraordinarily high point, and it was always going to be difficult to match that. But I think it's still, you know, remarkable that the party, you know, was comfortably the first party. You know, that the second to Vetvindozi was the PDK with about whatever 22-24%. Now that's a significant gap between the main party and the second party. So, you know, they still got more votes than the party in second and third combined, which again is extraordinary for a party that has been in power for 4 years. That always brings with it challenges, criticisms. People get tired of you, want to change, all these kinds of things. So for them to still, you know, win so many votes, I think was quite remarkable. And albeit they didn't hit the height that they hit before, it still shows that the party is significantly further ahead than any other political movement.
Since it looks that it will be impossible to form the government by himself, do you see any possibility to make a coalition with other parties from the opposition?
It's going to be a challenge. I mean, everybody knows that. That's going to be difficult. You know, it really does depend how many seats the party gets. You know, it's possible to imagine a scenario where, with the 10 minority seats plus the one Serb that isn't Srpska list, if they got 50 seats plus those 11, then you would have just a bare majority in Parliament. But if that doesn't happen, then, you know, we're in a scenario where you could, you know, possibly have a coalition government between, you know, Vetvindozi and the PDK or the LDK. But as you know, all the opposition parties have come out and said that they won't enter into coalition with them. But, you know, we know from the past in Kosovo that what parties say after an election sometimes changes, you know, so we'll have to see what happens in the coming weeks. But it's certainly going to be an interesting period in Kosovo's history. Hopefully it'll be resolved soon, because Kosovo needs to sort the situation out quickly. It can't spend too much time focusing on domestic political machinations.
Yeah, here we have the results without the vote of the diaspora. Was any surprise to you from the opposition? Like, did you think that, for example, LDK would get more votes?
Yeah, I mean, they spent a huge amount of money on their campaign, and, you know, given their history as being central to Kosovo's evolution, the Rugova, you know, it is quite a slap in the face that they struggled to get 18% of the vote. You know, they were, you know, comfortably behind the PDK. But as I say, I think the remarkable thing is if you add up the PDK and the LDK vote, it's less than Vetvindozi, which, you know, if you'd said that to somebody 6 years ago, people wouldn't have believed it. You know, so it really is quite a remarkable shift. And you know, they've been the most popular party in Kosovo now since the 2017 election. So this is the 4th election in a row where they've come out comfortably on top, which again says something about how popular the party is and how their popularity is sustaining. It's not just a kind of a protest vote. You see lots of populist parties emerging in Europe, far-right parties that, suddenly do very well, but the next election they collapse. So this clearly is a phenomenon now that has proved itself to be sustainable, and people have to, take this movement and this public appetite for change seriously.
Professor, there is also an option that opposition, if they become together, they could make the government. Do you see that happening?
It could happen. I mean, the numbers do add up, possibly. I mean, we have to wait and see how the final results go. But if you had a coalition government between the PDK, the LDK, NISMA and the AAK, plus the minority parties, it starts to look like what we would say in Ireland is a dog's dinner. It just looks like a mess, and it would be very difficult to see that would provide any kind of stability for the country. But it's conceivable, it's possible. There's been grand coalitions before in Kosovo's history, but this government has lasted the full length of its mandate, and it's worth remembering that previously in the previous 7 years you had 4 different elections, and that stemmed from these coalitions that were held together, very weak coalitions that didn't really have any coherence. And it would be terrible if that happened again. And I can see that the opposition parties, collectively they may have enough seats, but they wouldn't be able to put forward a coherent program for Kosovo.
Professor, international media such as the Financial Times, The Guardian, Deutsche Welle described Kurti as a hardline left-wing nationalist when they were reporting about the elections. How do you see Kurti? He is a left-wing nationalist?
I think you could call somebody a lot worse than a left-wing nationalist. I mean, it would be significantly worse to be in a situation where Kosovo was being governed by somebody who was a right-wing nationalist. And all across Europe, and all across the West, all across the world, right-wing, authoritarian, nationalist politicians are coming to power. If Kurti is being presented in that way, then I think the first thing to say is that's certainly preferable to the general trend elsewhere. But the second thing I think to say would be that it's just not true. Outside of Kosovo, in Western Europe, there is a tendency to see nationalism as something inherently dark, as something regressive. But it's very comfortable for Western journalists, Western intellectuals to talk about nationalism in purely negative terms, because they've never had to exercise a national identity as a means of emancipation. And the people of Kosovo did have to do that in the 1970s, 80s and 90s. Being Albanian was not just a kind of a flag you would wave on your day of, your national flag day or something like that, like you do in other parts of Europe. It was something that was a meaningful symbol of resistance. And I'm from Ireland, and I know what that means as well, that our flag and our national identity is more than just a kind of a commodity. So when journalists and academics see people like Kurti talking very proudly about what it is to be an Albanian and celebrating their national identity, in their heads it appears to be regressive nationalism. But I would suggest it isn't that. It's actually progressive. It stems from emancipation from an oppressive regime, which was the Yugoslav regime and the Milosevic government. So I think that they're misrepresenting Kurti. And when his party first emerged, there was so much criticism of him and so much kind of hysterical commentary about the party, that they were anarchists, they were Marxists, they were all this kind of stuff. And the people of Kosovo have demonstrated they don't listen to that. That was all a lie. I remember being here in 2009 and somebody talked about the party and said they'll never achieve anything because the people know they are extremists. But they've proved that that's not true. And like I said before, you can't say that the people of Kosovo have chosen in 2017, 2019, 2021, and again in 2025 to vote for an extremist party.
Yeah,
that's
just to add to that, also by the opposition, he was called the radical leftist.
Yeah, well, of course they're going to say that. I mean, it's the kind of thing that, Donald Trump called Kamala Harris a communist. I mean, Kamala Harris is clearly not a communist. In the course of an election campaign, people are going to say stupid, ridiculous things. And I think that, when you hear politicians in Kosovo saying that kind of thing about the party or about Kurti personally in the course of an election campaign, I think you have to put it down to that. But when international observers talk about him and his party in that way, it's disrespectful to the people of Kosovo. It's not just a lie, it's disrespectful.
How you have seen the Kurti's governance during these years, during these last 4 years?
I mean, it's been an extremely challenging period for any government. If you think about what was going on in the world over the course of the last 4 years, what's been going on in the region, to have survived in government for that length of time, I think is first of all a remarkable achievement. There's obvious major achievements domestically in terms of bringing down the unemployment rate, more sort of social welfare provisions and stuff like that. But I think the most important thing that I would suggest the government has done is that it has reasserted Kosovo's international personality. That for far too long, governments in Kosovo were willing to just compromise whenever they were asked to by the United States or by the European Union. And that stopped under this government. And it was essential that stopped, because in my view, Kosovo was very, very close to being pushed into the wilderness from which you would never return again. It was going to be asked to make compromises on this, on that, on everything.
Also, we have achieved a lot when we were coordinated with the international partners, like being part of international organizations, getting new recognitions, and so on. So in the last years, that didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, but again, that is a function of factors beyond the government's control. If you look at, for example, you mentioned recognitions. If you look at the countries that recognize Kosovo, they tend to be countries that are allied with the United States. Now, there's only a certain number of countries that are inclined to be pro-US, pro-Western. And that kind of figure reached its limit around 2014, 2015. So Kosovo's recognitions were unlikely to increase dramatically after that. So long as Serbia continued to refuse to recognize Kosovo, other countries were going to see Kosovo as an example of unilateral cessation that they didn't want to endorse. So that recognition thing was always going to reach a kind of a roof. There was going to be a kind of a ceiling that they couldn't necessarily go past. The other thing is to say that recognition is important, but it doesn't really change the dynamics on the ground. If you got certain countries in Africa or Oceania to recognize Kosovo, it's nice, but does it really make a concrete difference? The key thing that Kosovo needs is recognition from the 5 EU non-recognizers, and that would make a substantive difference to Kosovo's evolution going forward. And much more could have been done and should have been done by governments of Kosovo from 2008 on, and the international community, to put pressure on those 5 countries to do what's sensible and recognize Kosovo.
But when Kurti was not in power, we got a recognition from the State of Israel.
Yeah.
During the Houthi government.
That was when the Washington Agreement was signed.
Yeah.
I mean, the Washington Agreement I think will go down in history as one of the most bizarre international agreements ever signed. There was provisions in that agreement that had absolutely nothing to do with Kosovo and Serbia. Decriminalizing homosexuality, banning Chinese internet in the region. These were things that had nothing to do with Kosovo and Serbia. When the agreement was signed, Donald Trump said it was a great day for peace in the Middle East. In the Middle East. So Kosovo allowed itself in that particular agreement to be again used as a pawn. It signed an agreement with Serbia that had nothing to do with recognition, nothing to do with reparations, nothing to do with the fate of the missing, nothing to do with all the mass graves in Serbia that are filled with the bodies of Kosovo Albanians. And again, it was one of those times where, yes, we got an agreement, but what actually came from that agreement that was good for Kosovo? What concrete positive came from that? Recognition by Israel. Okay, what does that mean in practice? Does that make it easier to join the UN? Does that make it easier to join the EU?
Do you think that Trump will push sides to implement this agreement since he got back to power?
I imagine he's forgotten he signed that agreement. I don't think it will be something that he, thinks about too much. God knows what he's going to do going forward. I would hope that any sensible analyst of European and Balkan affairs would understand that the single biggest threat to stability in the Balkans and economic development in the Balkans and stability and economic development in Europe comes from aggressive Serbian nationalism. Aggressive Serbian nationalism will cause conflict and instability in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Montenegro, like it did in the 1990s. And recognizing Kosovo, ensuring that Kosovo's borders are considered to be sacrosanct, is a means of preventing that from happening. Now, if Trump is, as he clearly is, somebody who, primarily focuses on money and has a transactional view of the world, then it's possible to imagine somebody making the case to him that the solution to this particular problem, to prevent conflict erupting in the Balkans and spreading to Europe and having a negative impact on the United States economy, is to negate aggressive Serbian nationalism, and hence we need to give more support to the government of Kosovo.
So you don't see any crisis between the Kurdi government and the international partners?
Well, there has been for the last 4 years, clearly. But at some point, it has to be appreciated by the people of Kosovo and international observers, but certainly by the people of Kosovo, that the United States today is not the same United States that intervened in 1999. The people of Kosovo have every right to celebrate.
But it is still crucial for our security.
Yes, but you can't, as a self-respecting sovereign state, simply agree to everything that somebody you respect asks you to do. There has to be a limit to that. Now, KÖNDI has demonstrated that if you look at his evolution as an individual and as a politician, that over time his positions have changed. He has been willing to compromise. He's been willing to adapt a different set of policies. He's not as rigid as he once was. But there has to be a red line somewhere. And that red line was certainly breached by a number of previous governments of Kosovo. And I think KÖNDI had every right to say, there are certain things I simply won't do. And to continue to appease aggressive Serbian nationalism is not just bad for Kosovo, it's bad for the entire region. And that's the context in which KÖNDI was involved in these kind of hostile interactions with the international community. Somebody can say to me, he should have signed this particular agreement because Kosovo would have benefited in the following ways. I'd like to hear it. But all you tend to hear from people in Kosovo, and all these people that make the claim that KÖNDI has jeopardized Kosovo's future and all that kind of stuff, all they ever say is, well, we love America and we have to do what America says. That's a recipe for disaster. No self-respecting state in the world would simply do what whatever their ally tells them to do, because your ally's interests may well change, and America's interests have changed. The EU's interests have changed. There's so many people internationally can demonstrate that the United States and the EU have spent the last 10 years, if not longer, appeasing Vučić, and that's been a disaster for Serbia internally, in terms of it enabling him to capture the Serbian state, engage in corruption and violence and all the terrible things that he's doing domestically. But it's been a disaster regionally as well, because it's emboldened Serbian nationalists throughout the region, whether it's Dodek in Republika Srpska, or whether it's the Serbian list engaging in terrorist operations inside the territory of Kosovo. And that had to be stopped.
Another important topic is about the situation in the northern part of Kosovo. KÜNDI has taken some decisions there, but he didn't have support from the international partners. Most of them said that he's taking unilateral actions. How do you see today the situation in the north? Is it better than it used to be, or KÜNDI government has done mistakes with the way they have approached to certain decisions?
I think one of the things people should do when they're looking into how the situation is in the north of Kosovo is to ask Serbs that live in the north of Kosovo. And the reports from various different Serbian NGOs going back a number of years all say that Serbs in the north of Kosovo feel less secure today than they did previously. So there's no point in denying that. They do feel more threatened. They do feel that tensions have increased. So that's the reality. But the question then is, well, why has this happened? Why have we ended up in this particular situation? Now, again, if you can find any Western state that would allow the northern part of its country to be essentially run by a different state, to have a completely parallel system to the central government, and that they would be okay with that, then I'd like to know about it. It just doesn't happen. Now, there are many countries that have granted autonomy or various different enhanced rights to certain groups inside their state, and that's absolutely fine. But that's done through consensus. That's done through the central government agreeing to give these powers to different communities. But you couldn't have a situation where the northeastern part of France is governed by a group that claims allegiance to Germany and has a parallel system there. So what the government of Kosovo was doing what any self-respecting state would do, which was ensuring that they exercised internal sovereignty. And if you don't exercise internal sovereignty, you're not a sovereign state. And Kosovo's attempts to win international recognitions, to present itself as an independent state, are completely undermined. If somebody can say, but you don't have control over these 4 northern municipalities. Inside this area, you have de facto lost control. They use a different currency. They use a completely different system in every respects. And KÖNDI wanted to stop that, and the government wanted to stop that. And you know, I think they did it in a way that certainly annoyed the international community. And again, I'm not going to try and pretend that that didn't happen.
Just to add to that, and because of these actions in the north, we are under sanctions from the European Union.
Yeah.
So how harmful is that for Kosovo to be under sanctions from the European Union?
Well, how harmful is that for the European Union? You know, anybody that looks at the origins of the conflict in Kosovo, you know, the absolute extreme violence that took place in 1998 and 1999. If you look at the history of that conflict, almost everybody will admit that the warning signs were there from 1986, from 1981, going back even earlier, and that the international community at various different points could have stepped in to prevent this horrific violence from taking place. And that episode in the history of Western diplomacy is now an embarrassment. That people will look at that and say, how did they manage to get it so badly wrong? I think that this is exactly what's going to be said about this phase in Western diplomacy as well. That people in 10 years' time will look back at this and think, how do we have a situation where the European Union sanctioned Kosovo and didn't sanction Serbia for supporting a terrorist organization? That when the Banjska attack happens, Vučić declares a day of mourning. The Serbian list, whose deputy leader was one of the attackers, declares 3 days of mourning. Why is the international community not dealing more robustly with that?
Yeah.
How is it that Kosovo is being sanctioned? So if somebody behaves like that, like the European Union is behaving, it doesn't reflect badly on the government of Kosovo. It reflects extremely badly on the priorities of the people in power in the European Union. It's a massive embarrassment. It's a shameful episode for the European Union. And nobody in Kosovo should look at that and think, we must have done something wrong if we're being sanctioned. Because the government of Kosovo, in my view, hasn't done anything wrong.
Professor, former special envoy for Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, Richard Grenell, has made several tweets against our Prime Minister KÖNDI. He accused KÖNDI of being unreliable partner. Why Grenell is so critical towards KÖNDI?
I think there's a massive personality clash there.
So you think it's a personal issue?
Yeah, I mean,
Why?
Well, look, Richard Grenell issued a series of tweets in, I think it was 2015, saying that Donald Trump was a disgrace. He was unreliable. He was definitely going to lose the primary, and that nobody should vote for him. And then, of course, when Trump becomes president, Grenell changes his mind and thinks Trump is wonderful. This is a man who has no principles. This is somebody who is, again, purely out for his own interests at any given time. Now, when a character like that, when somebody who is devoid of principles, who looks at the world purely from a selfish point of view, what can I get? What can I get? How can I use people? When somebody like that meets somebody who does have principles, of course they're going to hate them, because they see in that other person everything that they lack. And if you're an international diplomat, if you're presenting yourself as an international diplomat, and you're taking to Twitter to engage in vindictive criticisms of a sitting prime minister, again, that suggests there's something wrong with you. You know, you're not a diplomat if you engage in that. This is a man who was effectively thrown out of Germany when he was ambassador to Germany because of his support for pretty much a neo-Nazi party in Germany. Is anybody really going to take what he says seriously about the Prime Minister of Kosovo? Richard Grenell has never been elected to any office in his life. KÖNDI has now won, his party has won the last 4 general elections in Kosovo. He has a popular mandate. He is somebody who, you know, even people who don't like him, I think, would have to admit that he is not somebody who is corrupt.
Do you see him being involved again on Kosovo-Serbia relations?
As far as I understand it, he's been given some mandate to deal with special missions or something like that. I know he's very close to Vučić, and I know that he's very, very close to Serbian interests more generally, so I would imagine that he would like to become more directly involved, but that can only be a bad thing for Kosovo. And again, does Richard Grenell represent the United States? What would Bill Clinton think about Richard Grenell? What would William Walker think about Richard Grenell? The United States that intervened in 1999 compared to Richard Grenell, it's a different, you know, it's just so different that you have to think, right, well, he doesn't really represent what is good about the United States. He represents everything that's actually bad about the United States.
Kurti accused him that he played a role overthrowing his government during his first mandate. Did Grenell play a role to overthrow a democratic government?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he did. Why wouldn't he? You know, why? I mean, of course, you know, there's various different ways that you can overthrow governments, obviously. You don't have to do it by sending in the Marines, you know, but certainly behind the scenes, I just don't believe that it's credible that he didn't encourage the LDK to pull down that government. I mean, even the ambassador at the time, the US ambassador, the day before the vote of confidence, he issued a tweet saying, "I'm looking forward to the vote of confidence, the no confidence vote passing tomorrow in the assembly." So that's an ambassador to Kosovo celebrating the fact that the government of Kosovo is going to be collapsed the next day. I mean, that's what the US ambassador was saying. God knows what he was saying in private. God knows what Grenell was saying.
Another thing that I would like to discuss with you is about the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. Can we expect more from the new European Commission and with the Trump administration? Do you think that things will move faster now?
No, I think it's likely to go into a kind of a state of stagnation for a while. Obviously, the most important issue is Ukraine, and the Trump administration seems to be willfully driving a wedge between the United States and Europe over the issue of Ukraine, and that has sent Europe into kind of hysterics and trying to work out what do we do now. So that will be the dominant issue. The chances of the European Union prioritising dealing with the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, which has been going on for so long with so little results in the midst of this crisis in Ukraine, I think is very, very remote. So I don't expect a huge amount to happen until the relationship between the United States and Europe has settled down, which maybe will take 6 months or 12 months. But of course, you never know. If there is another terrorist attack by Serb militia in Kosovo in the coming weeks or months, then that might change the dynamic somewhat. But for the moment, I think Trump's actions since becoming president again has caused Europe and the United States to really split apart quite substantially.
But there is an agreement between Kosovo and Serbia, already agreement. Prime Minister Kurti offered to sign it. He said that this deal is not bad for Kosovo. What is your comment about the already agreement? Do you think it's the right deal for Kosovo, the right agreement?
I don't think it really matters so much until Vučić agrees to it. I mean, if Vučić wanders around saying, I haven't signed that agreement and I will never sign that agreement, then it doesn't strike me that you have an agreement. I mean, Borrell and Lajčák and people like that can say we have an agreement, but you don't really have an agreement until...
Yeah, but EU insists that the agreement is still on the table. EU says that parties have to implement it. It doesn't matter who is in the power.
Well, again, I think that's worth asking, how can the EU be so deluded as to think that 2 parties have signed agreement when one party has said that it hasn't?
So why Kosovo, for example, is not implementing the agreement and saying that, look at the Serbia is not implementing, we have done our homework. But why also Kosovo is not doing it?
Because I mean, it would
its own part.
It would be foolish, to say the least, for one party to an agreement to fulfill its side of the agreement, while the other party refuses to. It just wouldn't make any sense.
To be the constructive part.
For how long has Kosovo done that? We have the ASM from 2013
Yeah, we'll talk about it, yeah.
because Kosovo agreed to something it didn't really want to agree to. We have the Kosovo Specialist Chambers, the Specialist Court, because the government of Kosovo agreed to something it didn't really want to agree to. And what did Kosovo get for the ASM agreement in 2013 and the creation of the Special Court 2 years later? I don't see that it got anything good from it. So if Kosovo keeps entering into negotiations with Serbia and with the EU, thinking, I'll just do whatever the EU says, and if Serbia refuses to honour its side of the agreement, well, I'll be the good boy and implement my side. That's beyond naive. It just would be madness, particularly over something as sensitive as the creation of the ASM. That just doesn't make any sense, you know.
Article 7 of the agreement talks about some sort of self-management. It's about the ASM. In your view, is that dangerous for the Kosovo sovereignty? What do you think about that point of the agreement, about the self-management? Is that sort of autonomy for the Serbs?
Yeah, I think it's very, very dangerous.
What should Kosovo do?
I mean, Kosovo already has probably the most generous provisions relating to minority rights of any country in Europe. So it doesn't have to look at its current constitution with any kind of shame. It already gives minorities extraordinary rights that, you know, other countries don't, you know, afford to their own minorities. So why is the ASM necessary? You know, that's a question that I think a lot of people fail to ask. You tend to hear this thing that, well, Kosovo signed the agreement in 2013.
Yes, Kosovo agreed for that.
Yeah, so it has to implement it. But, you know, look at the United States at the moment. How many agreements has it signed that it is now backing out of? States don't continue to honour agreements that are damaging to its internal sovereignty or to its external sovereignty or to its economic development. The United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, they will have all, in the past 25, 50 years, signed agreements that they later backed out of. And that's just a fact. The United States initially signed the Rome Statute about the International Criminal Court, backed out of that. Nuclear non-proliferation treaties, backed out of that. So this notion that Kosovo is being exceptionally unreasonable by not implementing an agreement that the current government never signed and was really against, that the people of Kosovo don't want to see implemented, again, I think is just legalistic naivety. Is that agreement good for Kosovo? Is that agreement good for the Kosovo Serbs? Who actually wants that agreement to be signed? I would suggest that the group that is most keen for that agreement to be signed is Vučić and his cabal. They want that agreement to be signed because they see it as a means by which they can undermine Kosovo's domestic sovereignty. Now, if that's the primary motivation for this agreement...
So you don't think there will be a benefit from the local Serbs from ASM?
Well, again, it depends who you ask, but I would imagine that again, the local Serbs would say that they would like to see this agreement implemented, but they would, again, I think, be the kind of people who don't want to recognize Kosovo. So the Serbs in the northern part of Kosovo have historically been the Serbs within the broader Kosovo Serb community that have been least willing to integrate with Kosovo. They're not the same people that live outside of the 4 northern municipalities. And it's worth remembering that the majority of Kosovo Serbs don't live in the north of Kosovo. So this fixation with the Serbs in the north of Kosovo, I think, overlooks the fact that there are Serbs elsewhere in Kosovo. But again, yes, I'm sure they would like to see it created. But they are people who, again, do not recognize Kosovo's existence. So if you're the government of Kosovo, you want to appease a group that doesn't recognize your existence? Again, I don't see that makes any sense.
Professor, I've been many times in the northern part of Kosovo and I've met locals there. Some say that Kurti did not keep his promise to make internal dialogue with them. Why Kurti did not make this kind of dialogue as he promised?
I mean, I've never spoken to anybody in the government who've said that they would refuse to speak to Kosovo Serbs from the north of Kosovo. If that is in practice what has happened, then that you know, is a strategic mistake. I don't see there's any logic to refusing to engage.
So do you believe there should be more dialogue with local Serbs?
Yes, of course, with Serbs throughout Kosovo. You know, the government of Kosovo should represent all the people of Kosovo, whether they're Serbs, Bosniaks, Turks, whatever. And certainly, you know, the engagement with the Serbian community should be one of the things that the government of Kosovo does prioritise. But again, this fixation with the Kosovo Serbs has, you know, they are about 5–6% of the population, you know, and about 2 to 3% of the population. So about half of that number live in the north of Kosovo. And not all of them are as anti-KÖNDI and the current government and of Kosovo as a whole as others are. So we're talking about a very small minority of the population of Kosovo who get this disproportionate amount of attention paid to them. Now, in my view, if you're a Kosovo Serb and you want to live in North Mitrovica, and you don't want to recognise Kosovo, and you want to fly a Serbian flag outside your house, you should be allowed to do it. That's fine, you can do that. And I think the government of Kosovo would accept your right to do that as well. But you don't have the right to engage in any kind of military attacks against the police or Kosovo government officials or anything like that. And likewise, because you don't support Kosovo's right to exist, have the right to create some new judicial legalistic mechanism that will enable you to extricate yourself from Kosovo's internal sovereignty.
Another topic that I would like to discuss with you, Professor, is about the Banjska paramilitary terrorist attack. The former vice president of Serbian list, Milan Radojic, accepted that he orchestrated the attack, but still, to the day that we're talking, there is no punishment against Serbia from the international community. Why there is no punishment for Serbia of what happened in Banjska, where one Kosovo police died?
It's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. You know, the drone footage very clearly showed him inside the monastery.
The origin of the arms.
Yeah. Okay. So we have images of him there. And because of those images, he had to admit that he was there. And now we know that this guy has admitted he was there, who was, as you say, intimately involved in the leadership of the Serbian list, the political party that has won every Serb seat in the last, I think, 4 or 5 elections. Now, that has to send a message to the international community that this isn't a rogue group of Serbs that live up in the woods and came down with a few hunting rifles. This was a properly armed militia. You know, the Kosovo Serbs are very resourceful people, but they didn't grow those arms themselves. They clearly imported them from Serbia. Now, again, you would want to be very foolish, very naive, to think that the government of Serbia was not aware of the fact that there was arms being transferred from Serbia into the north of Kosovo. So, again, it doesn't take a genius to work out that there was a link between Belgrade and the attack at Banjska. And we have an admission from this guy that he was involved in it. So all of that should have been, you know, just wrapped up into a ball and presented to Serbia and to the Serbian list as grounds for punishment, clearly grounds for punishment. And yet what we see, in fact, is that not only do the European Union and the United States not take action specifically against Belgrade or the Serbian list party, this guy wanders around Belgrade openly, goes for dinner with government ministers, you know, as if he did nothing wrong. And we're expected just to move on and ignore that. A policeman was murdered in this particular situation. Again, think about the parallels internationally. Is there any country in the world, in Europe, that would allow that to happen? Would allow a terrorist organization masquerading as a political party to continue to exist inside its territory, not to engage in any punishment of that particular group, and not to ask its allies to help it to punish the people that provided the arms to this group? You know, it's an extraordinary situation. It's yet further, it brings further shame on the European Union and the United States, and it's more evidence of that problem that I spoke about before, of the appeasement of Serbia that's been taking place since Vučić was elected in 2012.
In this last part of the interview, I want to ask you about the geopolitics. what's happening today with the US? We see that they are not finding the common ground, the common language with European allies. Mm-hmm. Why is this approach from the US towards the European Union countries?
There's always been a strain of what would be called isolationism in the United States, going back, to the 19th century, where there's been a particular political community in the United States that has said we shouldn't be involved in international affairs, or particularly Europe, because Europe will cause us to be drawn into wars we don't want to be drawn into. Even before the Pearl Harbor attacks, the United States said very clearly, what's happening in Europe is none of our concern. We don't want to be involved in this war that's taking place. But obviously they were dragged in because of what happened to Pearl Harbor. So the Trump administration, I think, is picking up on that pre-existing trend. We should be isolated from the rest of the world anyway. But it is also a factor, a function of the fact that the international distribution of power has shifted markedly away from the West towards Russia, towards China, towards Brazil, towards South Africa, towards Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, these countries.
Are we living today in a multipolar world?
Yeah, definitely.
Is US concerned with the rise of China as a global power?
Yeah. I mean, China is making great strides towards becoming the dominant power in the international system. The United States is still, by some distance, the most powerful state in the world today. But if you compare it to the height of its power between 1998 and 2003, that was when the United States really was extraordinarily more powerful than any of the great powers put together. But since around 2008, we had the global financial crisis, you had Russia's invasion of Georgia. These things signaled that unipolar world order was coming to an end. And we're now moving towards a multipolar world order, which sees the rise of these other new powers and invariably causes the previous dominant power, the United States and the West more generally, to start to turn against itself, to kind of to draw back on its international commitments and to rethink its foreign policy. And in that context, when people are looking around for a new idea, a new agenda, people like Donald Trump, who offer very, very simple answers to very complicated questions, that resonates with the population in America, who have grown tired of what they see as America's failure to provide for its own people, to provide the kind of lifestyle that was promised when the Cold War ended.
And what is the role of UK today in this complex world? Is still UK a world power as it used to be?
Well, I mean, the United Kingdom is still a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and that does bring with it quite substantial power. It still has nuclear weapons. It also has soft power, which is really important in terms of the fact that people all over the world have heard about James Bond and the Beatles and Oasis or whatever it happens to be. So, cultural power is part of a country's international power, but it's clearly losing power by virtue.
We're not seeing much involvement in Balkans from
No,
UK as it used to be.
It obviously because of Brexit, it lost significant power within the European Union. But its diplomacy in the Balkans as well, it has tended to simply align itself with whatever the United States says. And that quint that exists, that issue these statements from time to time, seems to me now that that's just been driven by the US. And the UK really does need to do much more to demonstrate that it is a global power, because it's fast losing international credibility. And to be more engaged in Kosovo, a country where the vast majority of the people of Kosovo have a very favourable view of the United Kingdom, that could be one avenue towards reasserting the United Kingdom's international power and strength, and to demonstrate that it has the capacity to still project power overseas and to still influence the behaviour of certain states, and to stop the spread of aggressive Serbian nationalism.
Yeah. And the main topic nowadays, Professor, is about the negotiations that are going on between the US and Russia for Ukraine, but without Ukraine in the table. Do you think that Zelensky will be pushed to accept a painful agreement at the end? How do you see the end of this war between Ukraine and Russia?
It looks that like the Trump administration wants Ukraine to agree to give Russia, the eastern provinces and Crimea, to accept that those are now under Russian control. and that would be presented as some kind of peace deal. Now that would be an absolute disgrace. That would be akin to the 1938 Munich Agreement, where Chamberlain allowed Hitler to take parts of Czechoslovakia. You know, the history of appeasing violent leaders is one that should frighten us, you know, and what's happening today with respect to Ukraine really is, has very eerie echoes of the 1930s, and it's a moral disgrace. It's also a strategic blunder.
And the final question, Professor, I want to return again to Kosovo. How Kosovo should behave in these new geopolitical circumstances?
I mean, I think Kosovo has a very positive story to tell. You know, this is something that I always talk about when I'm back in the United Kingdom or wherever I go anywhere. I talk about Kosovo as being a place that's full of business entrepreneurs, cultural entrepreneurs, fantastic tourist facilities, you know, great food, great people, great energy, a really thriving media environment, civil society activism. You know, the recent elections, for all the, you know, the machinations that are going to follow in the next couple of weeks, were free and fair. There was no vote tampering, there was no acts of violence. These are all really positive things that Kosovo can talk about and can present that image internationally. And the other really important thing I think that Kosovo can do is that it can present itself internationally, again, as a means by which the #1 threat to peace and security in the region can be negated, which is Kosovo's independence. An independent Kosovo doesn't threaten anybody. It's not going to cause any repercussions within this area because Kosovo is de facto independent already. It's very obviously de facto independent. So the further recognition of Kosovo is not going to, you know, cause any changes to the borders of the former Yugoslavia or the Balkans more generally. And that case needs to be made much more by not just the government of Kosovo, but Kosovo's embassies overseas, who have been underfunded and understaffed and have not presented that positive image of Kosovo culturally, business-wise, but also as a means of ensuring peace in the region.
Professor, I want to thank you very much again for your time.
Thank you. Cheers.
Pra shikues të nderuar, kaq kishim nga kjo intervistë me profesorin e marrëdhënieve ndërkombëtare Aidan Hehir. Mua më mbetet vetëm t'ju falenderoj dhe mirupafshim.